Silver doesn't disappear with sirens or headlines. It disappears inside spreadsheets, delays, and budgets that quietly explode. Right now, more than 70% of the world's silver is being consumed by industry, while the US is committing hundreds of billions of dollars to solar, electric vehicles, and data infrastructure that all depend on the same metal. At the same time, China controls much of the refining and manufacturing, locking silver directly into its own supply chains. The price hasn't warned anyone. The shortage isn't loud, but the math is already breaking, and America is only discovering the problem after the money is spent. Silver is treated like a background material in America. It doesn't get speeches, it doesn't get headlines, it doesn't get emergency meetings. It just quietly moves through the system, ounce by ounce, holding modern life together. That's why the problem starts here. Not with prices, not with markets, but with a misunderstanding so deep that almost no one notices it until something stops working. Silver is not stored the way gold is stored. It is not admired, displayed, or protected. It is consumed. Once it enters the system, it doesn't come back out. It's soldered into circuit boards, fused into solar cells, embedded into medical equipment, buried inside vehicles, and scattered across millions of products that are never designed to be taken apart again. And every year, America permanently loses billions of dollars worth of silver without ever calling it a loss. More than 70% of global silver demand today is industrial, not jewelry, not coins, industry. Every smartphone contains silver. Every data center depends on it for conductivity and heat control. Every modern military communication system uses it. A single large solar installation can require thousands of ounces. An electric vehicle uses roughly 2 to 3 times more silver than a traditional gasoline car. And this isn't optional usage. There is no cheaper substitute that performs the same function at the same scale. Silver is used because it is the most electrically conductive metal known. That's not a branding choice. That's physics. And physics doesn't care about budgets, policy deadlines, or supply shortages. Here's where the math starts to feel uncomfortable. America is pushing aggressively into energy transition, electrification, and data expansion all at the same time. Solar capacity is being expanded with federal subsidies, measured in the tens of billions of dollars. EV production targets are climbing into the tens of millions of vehicles per year. Data centers supporting AI and cloud infrastructure are consuming power and materials at levels that didn't exist a decade ago. Every one of these systems quietly pulls silver from the same finite pool. And unlike oil or gas, silver isn't something you can ramp up overnight. You can't flip a switch and produce more. You can't release strategic reserves that don't exist in meaningful size. The critical mistake was assuming silver behaved like other commodities. It doesn't. Silver is mostly mined as a byproduct of other metals like copper, lead, and zinc. That means silver production doesn't respond directly to silver demand. If copper production slows, silver supply slows with it, even if silver demand explodes, even if prices rise, even if governments suddenly realize they need more. New mines take 10 to 20 years to bring online. Permits, financing, environmental approvals, labor, infrastructure, all of it moves slowly. Meanwhile, ore grades are declining. It takes more rock, more energy, and more money to extract the same ounce of silver today than it did decades ago. Costs rise quietly. Output struggles to keep pace, and demand keeps accelerating. China understands this dynamic very clearly. That's the part that rarely gets discussed without shouting. China isn't buying silver for speculation, it's locking it into supply chains. It controls large portions of global solar manufacturing. It dominates refining capacity. It plans in decades, not quarters. While America debates incentives and timelines, China secures materials. Not loudly, not emotionally, systematically. That doesn't mean silver disappears tomorrow. It means access tightens gradually and priorities shift long before the public notices. Industrial users get first access, strategic sectors get protection, everyone else competes for what's left. This is why silver shortages don't look like empty shelves. They look like delays, budget overruns, projects pushed back due to supply constraints, factories operating below capacity, infrastructure plans revised quietly, costs passed downstream in ways that are hard to trace. When silver becomes harder to source, the system doesn't announce a crisis. It absorbs stress until it can't. And by the time shortages are visible to consumers, access is already restricted, prices are no longer the main issue, and decisions have already been made behind closed doors. The most dangerous part is that silver feels cheap. At tens of dollars per ounce, it doesn't trigger alarm. But price has never reflected importance. Oxygen is free until it isn't available. Silver is the same. The system priced it as if availability was guaranteed, as if global trade would always function smoothly, as if industrial demand would never collide with geopolitical reality. That assumption is now being tested in real time, not by panic, not by collapse headlines, but by a slow, structural squeeze that most people don't even know they're inside of yet. And once you understand how silver actually moves through the system, the next question becomes unavoidable. If this is already happening quietly, what happens when it's no longer quiet? The demand shock didn't arrive as a single event. It arrived as policy, incentives, and ambition stacked on top of one another until the math stopped working. On paper, the plans looked clean: expand solar, electrify transportation, build data infrastructure, reduce dependence on fossil fuels. What wasn't modeled honestly was material intensity, how much physical input each solution actually consumes when scaled to national and global levels. Silver sits at the center of that miscalculation, not as a rare luxury, but as a critical bottleneck. Start with solar, because this is where the numbers become impossible to ignore. A standard utility-scale solar installation can require tens of thousands of ounces of silver, depending on design and efficiency. Multiply that by the thousands of projects being built or planned across the United States alone, backed by federal spending measured in the tens of billions of dollars. Now zoom out globally. China installs solar capacity at a scale that dwarfs most countries combined. Europe is racing to expand renewables. India is following close behind. Each new panel contains silver that will never be recovered. There is no recycling loop at scale. The metal goes in, the power comes out, and the silver is effectively locked away for decades. Electric vehicles push the equation even further. A gasoline car uses silver sparingly. An EV uses it everywhere: power electronics, battery management systems, inverters, charging infrastructure. On average, an electric vehicle uses roughly 2 to 3 times more silver than a traditional internal combustion vehicle. Governments are setting targets in the tens of millions of EVs per year globally. Do the multiplication. Tens of millions of vehicles, multiplied by increased silver usage per unit, layered on top of already stretched industrial demand. This isn't theoretical demand. It's written into manufacturing plans, subsidies, and regulations that are already in motion. Then there's the part few people connect to silver at all: data. Data centers are expanding at an unprecedented rate, driven by cloud services, artificial intelligence, and digital infrastructure that now underpins everything from banking to defense. These facilities require massive electrical systems designed for efficiency, heat management, and reliability. Silver is used in contacts, switches, and high-performance components where failure isn't an option. As AI workloads grow, so does the power draw. As power draw increases, material demand rises with it. The more digital the economy becomes, the more physical silver it consumes behind the scenes. Here's the uncomfortable financial reality. Industrial demand alone now consumes the majority of annual silver supply, while investment demand fluctuates on top of it. When supply tightens, industry doesn't step aside. It pays up. Governments subsidize costs. Projects absorb overruns. The price signals don't immediately reach consumers because they're buffered by budgets measured in billions. A solar project doesn't get canceled because silver costs more. The cost gets passed on, hidden inside energy prices, taxes, or deficits. The system masks stress until it compounds. China's role in this demand surge is not emotional, it's arithmetic. China controls a dominant share of global solar panel manufacturing and a significant portion of refining and processing capacity. That means it doesn't just buy silver, it decides where silver flows. When domestic demand rises, exports shrink. When strategic priorities shift, availability changes elsewhere without warning. This isn't hoarding in the dramatic sense, it's supply chain gravity. Material flows toward the largest, most organized demand center. Right now, that center is not the United States. What makes this phase dangerous is timing. All of these demand curves are rising simultaneously. Energy transition, electrification, and data expansion were launched as parallel solutions, not sequential ones. Each assumes stable access to the same inputs. Silver doesn't scale that way. There's no slack. There's no warehouse full of excess metal waiting to be deployed. Annual production is largely spoken for before it ever leaves the ground. That means any disruption, mining delays, geopolitical friction, trade restrictions, or energy shortages, tightens the system immediately. At this stage, the question isn't whether demand will exceed supply. It already has in certain segments. The question is who gets prioritized when pressure builds. Industrial users will outbid others. Strategic sectors will be protected. Civilian access becomes secondary. And because silver demand is buried inside massive dollar figures, trillion-dollar infrastructure plans, multi-billion-dollar subsidies, national security budgets, the strain stays invisible to the public far longer than it should. By the time it surfaces in headlines, the decisions will already be made, the contracts locked in, and the shortages quietly normalized. If demand were the only problem, the system could adjust, prices would rise, production would respond, and supply would eventually catch up. That's how most people assume commodities work. Silver breaks that assumption, not because of speculation, but because of how it is produced. Silver is not primarily mined because the world wants silver. It's mined because the world wants copper, lead, and zinc. Silver just happens to come along for the ride. That single fact changes everything. Roughly 70% of newly mined silver comes as a byproduct. That means when silver demand surges, miners don't automatically produce more silver. They produce more only if it makes sense to expand base metal operations. And right now, many of those operations are constrained. Energy costs are higher. Environmental regulations are tighter. Labor is more expensive. Financing is slower. Even when prices rise, production does not respond quickly or proportionally. Silver supply is structurally rigid in a world that assumes flexibility. Developing a new mine is not a market reaction. It is a decade-long process. Exploration alone can take years with no guarantee of success. Permitting stretches on. Environmental assessments, community negotiations, infrastructure build-out, and capital financing can push timelines to 15 or even 20 years before meaningful production begins. By the time a new mine comes online, the demand environment that justified it may already have changed. That lag makes silver uniquely vulnerable to long-term shortages masked by short-term stability. The geology makes the problem worse. High-grade silver deposits are becoming harder to find. The average ounce today requires moving and processing significantly more rock than it did in the past. That translates directly into higher costs. More diesel, more electricity, more water, more labor. Every ounce becomes more expensive to extract, even as policymakers assume materials will remain cheap and abundant. The system builds plans on outdated assumptions, while the physical reality quietly shifts underneath. Recycling is often presented as the solution, but the numbers don't support it at scale. Silver is used in tiny amounts across billions of devices. Extracting it is technically possible, but economically inefficient. The cost of recovery often exceeds the value of the metal itself. Most silver embedded in electronics is never reclaimed. It ends up diluted, discarded, or locked into waste streams that are not designed for recovery. Recycling helps at the margins. It does not replace primary supply. This is where money enters the picture in a way few people track. Mining is capital intensive. New projects require billions of dollars up front with uncertain returns over long timelines. Investors demand stability, governments demand compliance, communities demand compensation. Meanwhile, silver prices have spent years suppressed by financial instruments that signal abundance even when physical supply tightens. That discourages investment exactly when it is most needed. Capital flows elsewhere. Mines age. Output plateaus. Demand keeps rising. The result is a system that looks balanced on paper but is brittle in reality. Annual production numbers appear steady, but they leave no buffer. There is no surge capacity, no strategic reserve of meaningful size, no rapid response mechanism when something goes wrong. When supply falters, the system doesn't break loudly, it stretches. Projects get delayed. Costs creep upward. Margins thin. The strain is absorbed quietly across budgets and timelines until it concentrates somewhere unavoidable. This is why silver shortages don't announce themselves with empty vaults. They show up as structural friction, as missed deadlines, as infrastructure projects that cost more and deliver less, as manufacturers quietly redesigning products to use thinner layers of metal, pushing performance closer to failure thresholds. These are not temporary inconveniences. They are signals that the system is operating at the edge of its material limits, and when a system runs without slack, it doesn't take much to push it from strained to broken. When supply can't expand and demand won't slow, the system reaches for a substitute. Not a physical one, but a financial one. This is where paper silver enters the picture, quietly holding the entire structure together. On the surface, it looks efficient. Futures contracts, exchange-traded funds, derivatives, promises of delivery. These instruments create the impression that silver is plentiful, liquid, and easily available, but what they actually trade is confidence, not metal. Most silver traded globally never moves an ounce. It exists as a claim. One contract represents future delivery. Another represents exposure to price. Another represents ownership without possession. The same ounce can be referenced, pledged, and promised multiple times across different layers of the financial system. As long as most participants settle in cash and not in metal, the structure holds. Prices stay calm. Volatility stays manageable. The illusion of abundance remains intact. Here's the critical imbalance. The volume of paper silver dwarfs the volume of physical silver available for delivery. Industrial users don't rely on contracts. They need metal in hand. When they source silver, they care about availability, timing, and purity, not spot price charts. But the price the world sees is shaped largely by financial flows, not by trucks moving metal to factories. That disconnect allows shortages to develop quietly while markets signal normalcy. This matters because price is supposed to be a warning system. Rising prices should signal scarcity and attract investment. Paper silver interferes with that signal. When supply tightens, contracts can be rolled, settled in cash, or offset. The stress never fully reaches the surface. Mining investment remains cautious. Recycling doesn't scale. Demand keeps growing. The system absorbs pressure instead of responding to it. Stability becomes fragile, not strong. Confidence is the only thing holding this together. As long as participants believe that delivery will not be demanded at scale, Paper claims can outnumber physical ounces without consequence. But confidence is not permanent. It erodes when industrial users begin to compete for limited supply, when geopolitical risks rise, or when strategic stockpiling accelerates. The moment more participants want metal instead of settlement, the structure tightens rapidly. This is where China's behavior becomes relevant again. When large industrial buyers secure long-term supply directly, bypassing open markets, they reduce available float. Less metal circulates. More remains locked inside controlled supply chains. The paper market still trades the same volume of claims, but the pool of deliverable metal shrinks underneath. The system doesn't break immediately. It becomes sensitive. Small disruptions cause outsized reactions. If this sounds abstract, the consequences are not. When access to physical silver becomes uncertain, priorities shift. Governments intervene. Strategic sectors receive guaranteed supply. Others are priced out or delayed. Contracts are renegotiated. Delivery times stretch. The public never sees a headline that says silver shortage. Instead, they see higher costs, missed targets, and explanations that never quite add up. Paper silver was designed to smooth markets, not replace reality. It works only as long as trust remains high and demand for physical delivery stays limited. Once that balance shifts, price becomes volatile, access becomes restricted, and the gap between financial claims and physical metal can no longer be ignored. At that point, silver stops behaving like a commodity and starts behaving like a fault line, invisible until the stress finally forces it to move. At this stage, the story stops being about price and starts being about power. Because when a material becomes scarce, money doesn't decide who gets it, priorities do. And this is where China's role matters far more than daily silver charts ever will. China is not reacting to shortages, it is planning around them. While markets argue over ounces and dollars, China secures control over flows, refining, and end use. That distinction determines who feels the shortage first and who barely feels it at all. China dominates the global solar supply chain. A majority of the world's solar panels are manufactured there, along with a significant share of the components that go into them. That means silver enters Chinese-controlled systems early and stays there. It is transformed into finished products and exported only after its role is locked in. The metal itself doesn't circulate freely. It disappears into infrastructure. When domestic demand rises, exports of finished goods are prioritized over raw material availability elsewhere. This isn't hoarding, it's industrial gravity. Refining is the quieter lever. Mining silver is one step. Turning it into usable industrial-grade material is another. China controls a substantial portion of global refining capacity. That gives it influence even over silver mined outside its borders. Metal extracted in one country often passes through Chinese processing before it reaches global markets. When refining capacity tightens or is redirected internally, availability elsewhere changes without a single mine shutting down. Supply appears stable, access is not. The United States, by contrast, relies heavily on global trade for refined silver. It consumes large amounts for defense systems, communications infrastructure, energy projects, and advanced manufacturing, but it does not control the full chain from extraction to refinement to deployment. That creates vulnerability during periods of stress. When demand spikes or supply tightens, the question becomes simple and uncomfortable. Who gets served first? In a tightening environment, silver doesn't flow to the highest bidder in open markets. It flows to the highest priority. Military and defense systems are protected. National energy projects receive allocation. Strategic industries secure contracts. Everything else waits. Civilian manufacturing competes for what remains. Investors are not part of this conversation at all. By the time shortages become visible to the public, access has already been rationed upstream. This is why price movements often lag reality. A government-backed project doesn't cancel because silver costs more. It absorbs the increase. A defense system doesn't delay because spot prices rise. It secures supply regardless of cost. The stress gets buried inside larger dollar figures. Billion-dollar infrastructure plans, multi-year defense budgets, long-term energy contracts. The market price becomes a poor indicator of actual scarcity. China's advantage is not secrecy, it's alignment. Policy, industry, and supply chains move in the same direction. When silver becomes strategically important, decisions are implemented quickly and quietly. The United States, by contrast, debates, fragments responsibility, and assumes markets will resolve shortages in time. That works when materials are abundant. It fails when materials are constrained and competition is global. When access tightens, the impact isn't dramatic at first. There are no sirens. There are no announcements. Instead, projects slow, costs rise, timelines stretch. Explanations reference temporary constraints and adjustments, but behind those words is a structural shift. Silver is no longer a neutral input. It becomes a strategic material. And once a material crosses that line, it stops flowing freely. It moves according to national interest, not market theory. By the time the effects reach everyday America, the damage is already normalized. Silver doesn't disappear from store shelves. It disappears from schedules, from budgets, from expectations. Infrastructure projects take longer than promised. Energy systems cost more than projected. Manufacturing timelines stretch, then quietly reset. What looks like mismanagement or bureaucracy is often something more basic. Materials that are harder to secure, arriving slower at higher cost, and with less flexibility than before. When silver tightens, the first break isn't visible to consumers. It shows up inside factories. Production lines are redesigned to use thinner coatings. Components are pushed closer to failure tolerances. Engineers compensate. Accountants absorb overruns. The public sees higher prices and hears vague explanations about supply chains. What they don't see is how close some systems are operating to their physical limits. There is very little margin left. When a system runs this lean, small disruptions cascade quickly. Energy is where this becomes impossible to ignore. Solar projects delayed by material constraints don't disappear from budgets. They roll forward with higher costs. Utilities pass those costs along. Households feel it months or years later in bills that never quite come back down. The transition is still happening, but it's more expensive, slower, and less reliable than promised. The silver constraint doesn't stop the plan. It quietly reshapes it into something heavier and harder to sustain. Manufacturing follows the same pattern. When access to silver tightens, companies prioritize high-margin products. Lower-margin goods are delayed or discontinued. Jobs tied to those lines disappear quietly. Communities feel the loss without a clear cause. The explanation is never, "we ran out of silver." It's market conditions, restructuring, or efficiency adjustments. The material constraint remains invisible, even as its effects spread outward. This is how modern shortages work. They don't arrive as emergencies. They arrive as friction, as cost creep, as delays that become permanent. Silver is not unique in this sense. It's simply one of the clearest examples of a system built on the assumption that critical inputs will always be cheap, available, and globally accessible. That assumption held for decades. It no longer does. The real danger isn't that silver runs out. It's that planning continues as if it never could. America didn't prepare for a world where strategic materials are contested, controlled, and prioritized elsewhere. It assumed markets would smooth everything out. That assumption is now being tested across energy, technology, and defense all at once. Silver doesn't cause the strain. It reveals it. This is not a warning about investment. It's a warning about structure. When essential materials stop behaving like commodities and start behaving like strategic assets, systems change. Access becomes conditional. Cost becomes secondary. And the public learns last. Silver is simply the metal making that shift visible first. If it's already happening quietly here, the uncomfortable question is what other assumptions are about to break the same way, without headlines, without panic, and without time to adjust.